Hello everyone. This has been a long-awaited video that I've been hyping up for the past 2 weeks or so, and I'm proud to say it has finally come. Before we begin, I would like to make a few things clear. This is not an attack on what we call the transgender community. This is a cry for the truth and a call for discussion. A lot of what is going to be discussed is my understanding of the situation and the conclusions of my personal research. I've been no ill will to those in need of mental health assistance, but this is a plea to stop and think about yourselves in the future. With the information I've gathered, my goal is to be as accurate to reality as possible and to inform you of the lies we've been told. Thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something from this video and engage in good faith discussion on this topic with those around you in the future. To begin, I'll be citing many sources, those who I believe to be credible in voicing their opinion on the matter, and I'll tell you their backgrounds hoping you see them as such also. First, we have Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson was accepted into and studied at the University of Alberta and later McGill University. For those in the United States, these two universities are considered two of the best and most prestigious universities in Canada. He also had a 5-year associate professorship at the Harvard University Psychology Department before moving to the University of Toronto. But if this hasn't persuaded you already, in 1991, he graduated with his PhD in clinical psychology. In his PhD dissertation, Patterns of Color and Personality, he examined the connection between personality characteristics and preferred color. His fascination in human behavior is well reflected in his hundreds of hours of free online lectures and the multiple books he's published. If you're still not persuaded, we'll look at his H-index, which calculates how frequently other scientists cite your work. For context, a successful scientist will have an index of 20, an outstanding one will have an index of 40, and a truly exceptional one will have an index of 60. Jordan Peterson has an H-index of 58, with over 11,000 citations, making him one of the top 50 most cited clinical psychologists of all time. For even more context, it's well above the average for Nobel Prize recipients. Another source is Sarah Stockton, who is a clinician in the field of therapeutic practice for transgender care. She was assigned to a transgender team, which gave her special training in understanding gender and body dysmorphia. She did comprehensive assessments to determine the readiness of children and adults for hormone blockers and eventually surgery. Another source I used was Ken Zucker, who served as the head of the Gender Identity Service at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto from 1981 to 2015. He was a pioneer for research in the field, especially regarding adolescents who suffered from gender identity disorder. And my last source is Miriam Grossman. She is a physician who went to New York University Med School and completed her internship in pediatrics at Beth Israel Hospital. She got her residency in psychiatry through Cornell Medical College, followed by a fellowship in child adolescent psychiatry. She is both board certified in psychiatry and in adolescent psychiatry, and is currently a practicing clinician. Now that I've covered my main references, it's time for an extremely important history lesson. First, we must understand what gender identity is. The definition Google will give you is a person's innate sense of their gender, but this doesn't really tell us much. Gender identity is a term introduced by John Money. He also coined the term gender roles and assigned at birth. He claimed that gender identity is completely separate from biology, and that male and female is something that is foisted upon a baby by society, completely unrelated to biology. Specifically, that males and females have biological distinctions, but are limited to menstruating, gestating, the carrying of a fetus, and lactating. Everything else, including personality, preferences, cognitive abilities, emotional styles, and perceptions, were social constructs, all of which is determined by the downward social pressure of parents and peers from birth to about the first 2.5 to 3 years of a child's life, and then it's fixed. To understand why he created this theory, we have to look back at John Money's childhood. He grew up on a farm where he had endured an extremely abusive, alcoholic, and chaotic father who not only beat him but his mother. This gave him a horrible impression and view on not only men but masculinity. The timing of this theory is also very interesting because the 50s were a time where stereotypes were heavily present pertaining to the societal roles of men and women, i.e. the wife and daughters being the ones who would cook in the kitchen while the father and son would be working on the family car. However, because of his childhood, he never wanted to be anything like his father, not even the same sex. He despised everything about masculinity in his own body that in one of his books, he wrote that the world would be better off if animals and men were castrated at birth, later saying that I wear the vile mark of male sexuality. So it's no surprise that he developed a theory in which gender is the socially ingrained part of us that is in complete contrast with biological sex. Because if his theory were true, he wouldn't have to contend with his own view of himself. It was the perfect scapegoat. And he was so fixated on this concept that he wrote his PhD on hermaphrodites and how to assign their sex. In fact, this is where the term assigned at birth comes from. This completely disregards the fact that sex can be observed 5 days after conception with IVF or in vitro fertilization, meaning sex is observed, not assigned. Regardless, he then opened the first clinic for hermaphrodites at Johns Hopkins that included treatments and surgeries for intersex individuals. It was the first time sex reassignment surgery was introduced to the US. This includes the castration and the removal of the penis and testicles. Now that he had his gender theory, he needed a way to prove it. Luckily for him, he found the perfect test subject. In 1966, a blue-collar family of parents in their early 20s gave birth to 2 twin boys who unfortunately had phimosis. Phimosis is a condition of the male foreskin where the skin is tight and unable to retract back behind the head of the penis. Doctors recommended circumcision, but unfortunately it was botched. Bruce was the first, and the equipment malfunctioned when they tried cauterizing the foreskin of the penis, and it ended up burning his entire penis instead. The couple was horrified and were looking for an answer when they saw an ad for John Money's clinic. So they flew up for a visit where John Money pitched his theory, telling them that male and female isn't related to chromosomes or hormones. John Money had the perfect prescription. He told them to raise Bruce as a girl. This included putting him in dresses, giving him dolls, and raising him parallel to that of a young girl, and giving him the name Brenda. But most importantly, never make him aware that he was born a male. Now you may be wondering how he convinced these parents to do this. Well, John Money was extremely charismatic. His sales pitch won them over so well that they viewed him almost like a god who had all the answers. If you're interested in knowing more details, I recommend the book As Nature Made Him, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Girl. Everything was going perfect for John Money. He needed a proof of concept. Being male and female is completely separate from biology, imposed on by society, a term we all know and have heard, a social construct. John Money had follow-up appointments every year and started the report on his study, where he began to write and lecture. He wrote that Bruce was doing great, acknowledging that he may have been somewhat of a tomboy, but overall was adjusting well, mimicking his mother, the whole package. With the glowing year-to-year report, he tracked tremendous attention, and it's no wonder. During this time, it was the mid-60s, for feminism and the sexual revolution, a time where society wanted nothing more than to say that men and women were practically equal on all fronts. In order to obtain equal rights and status, this concept had to be true, and now society was presented with the perfect narrative, a child with XY chromosomes who is successfully raised as a delicate little girl, who liked to cook, play with dolls, and will grow up to potentially have babies. John Money's theory was in full force at this point and had been accepted over the decades. It was practically doctrine, embedding itself in hard and soft sciences alike, biology, sociology, endocrinology, genetics, psychology, you name it, so much so that you could find it written in textbooks, and children with ambiguous genitalia would be automatically raised female. Other scientists were of course skeptical of this one case study, but John Money wouldn't tolerate rejection. He would intimidate editors of scientific journals, having any critical publications made unreachable to the public and other scientists, which is why there was little to no pushback on his theory for decades. So how were the twins doing at this time? Well, Bruce, now Brenda, changed his name once again to David in his teens. After 14 years of being a girl, he never felt like it was the truth. He was never happy with dresses, dolls, and he always wanted to play with his brother's toys. He portrayed so many signs of masculinity with his rough, aggressive, and boyish behavior that kids at his school called him Cave Woman and made fun of him for his masculine interests. This masculine expression was so prevalent that he preferred to pee standing up despite the extreme socialization. Later in his adult life, he married a woman and adopted 3 children and worked as a janitor in a slaughterhouse. He never felt confident enough to speak out, which is why the chaos endured as long as it did, but the whole story is much darker. His childhood and family were miserable when he was growing up. During these yearly checkups and evaluations by John Money, He would sexually abuse the twins, telling them to undress and mimic sexual intercourse, show them graphic pictures, and humiliate them. The twins eventually refused to go, leaving the parents in confusion. Eventually, another clinician, Dr. Paul McHugh, who worked at the same hospital as John Money, observed the outcomes of the reassignment and became harshly critical of it, eventually closing the Johns Hopkins Clinic permanently. He argued that we should pay attention to the psyches of the patients and help them more interpersonally and emotionally, instead of altering their physique. However, for Bruce, it was already too late, and for society, gender theory was already baked into sex education, sociology, and psychology. Now that we know the history of gender identity, let's examine the effects on the societal and cultural level. John Money recognized that there were only two possible genders at the time of his research. However, today, society telling you have to be a boy or you have to be a girl is similar or akin to racism or sexism. The male and female binary is viewed not only as restrictive, but evil. And if you present this to a young and liberal-minded audience, the thought of fighting this evil is rather attractive. And by 1998, the idea of gender being on a spectrum was in full force. It's fluid, and it remains fluid for your entire life. The idea of exploring and questioning your own gender is wonderful, and nobody can tell you who you are. Funny enough, John Money would have been very discontent with this theory, although if he was alive today, his own theory would have never been published or viewed as credible to any degree. About 20 years ago, gender identity disorder occurred in 1 to about 100,000. It was rare in adults, but even more rare in adolescents. Now studies show 10 to 20% of youth in their early to mid-teens might not identify with their sex. This is a staggering increase in dysphoric kids, and I personally believe is the result of a social contagion of what is scientifically referred to as a psychological epidemic. Roughly 100 years of diagnostic history shows that it primarily afflicted boys and men who were primarily either autogynephilic or suffered from identity problems. Within the last decade, a large surge in gender dysphoria was now present in women and adolescent girls who previously showed no history of it. If you're unfamiliar with the history of psychological epidemics, I recommend the book The Discovery of the Unconscious. There's a deep literary history behind these events. But furthermore, this lie has had a catastrophic ripple effect on our society. People want to know who they are. They don't want to be confused about it. There's great anxiety in not knowing who you are or what you'll become. Too much choice and too much freedom doesn't bring happiness, but stress. Therefore, giving people an infinite spectrum of choice that has great fluidity indefinitely is not a solution to one's identity crisis. Rates of depression in society have greatly increased in young people, especially women who are more likely to be victims of psychological epidemics. The Q in LGBTQ stands for questioning, which is the exact problem you are facing when discovering who you are. Not only is gender identity based on the theory of false presuppositions and a complete denial of reality, i.e. sex having nothing to do with biology, but it's being celebrated en masse. In fact, mental health professionals demonize those who don't affirm one's gender or accept the theory. Parents are now immediately given referrals to endocrinologists and prescriptions for hormone blockers after as little as 3 therapeutic sessions, going so far as to having pre-written documents for therapists to sign off on to make the process quicker. This is evidence that therapists are not doing enough trauma-informed care with these patients who demand their body parts be removed. This assumption that transition will be an easier route reveals the insufficiency in clinical practice. Studies show that the longer a doctor listens to their patients in the initial diagnostic interview, the more accurate their consequent diagnosis would be. Jordan Peterson's clinical practice history has pointed to the strong conclusion that weekly assessments of 1 to 2 years are required at minimum to understand a problem as complex as this and further develop a solution. Behavioral assessment and reviewing all the diagnostic markers for psychological behaviors is a mountain of challenges, but it's still achievable. However, this gender theory has been so indoctrinated in our scientific community and culture that denying it could put a practitioner's license at risk. Self-reporting and self-assessment is observed to be the main factor when determining whether an individual is valid to undergo gender-affirming care, which is significant malpractice as one needs to evaluate multiple diagnostic markers to come to possibly minimal conclusions. The American Psychological Association, or APA, in their guidelines admit there is no long-term follow-up studies on the mental health of those who transitioned across their lifespan, while also saying 3 pages later that kids are at a higher risk of suicide if they don't affirm. Both statements can't be true at once. This line of treatment is very destabilizing to the families of the kids who go through it. Parents are forming support groups in secret to grieve the radical change of their sons and daughters, because speaking out could produce great social consequences, including accusations of bigotry, risk of unemployment, and in some areas, government penalty. Parents are now the ones who are becoming suicidal, and worst of all, there is no scientific consensus on this type of treatment. Miriam Grossman and Jordan Peterson go into great detail about this on his podcast. There's a great deal of trauma when you watch your child be sterilized, physically transformed, and turn into a confused mess, while you have to stand by because you'll be subject to harsh punishment if you stand against it. But I'll get to more of my own personal thoughts in the conclusion. Let's learn about the actual science behind sex and the treatment they're giving to adolescents. Males and females are very similar, as we of course are all human, but on a biological and neurological level, they can be staggeringly different and manifest behaviors and traits that are greatly contrasted by observation. Your chromosomes, prenatal development, and the impact of your sexual hormones is significant. Every cell in your body that has a nucleus is stamped male or female. Female hearts are different from male hearts. In cardiology, for instance, ventricular arrhythmias, including ventricular tachycardia and ventricular fibrillation, are more commonly seen in men. On the other hand, women may be more prone to supraventricular arrhythmias, such as atrial fibrillation and atrioventricular nodal reentry tachycardia. The biological reaction to burn wounds is also different among males and females. Chromosomes have an impact on every system of the body. What constitutes sex is instantiated at every level of identity, biologically and socially. Kids and parents and students are now being told you can pause biology, or more specifically, puberty. Kids who go through precocious puberty, a rare medical disorder, which induces puberty between 6 or 8 years old, are typically given puberty blockers. They are then taken off the treatment when they reach a normal time for puberty to begin, and the results are generally positive. This treatment is now being used during Tanner Stage 2, which is a developmental stage around 10 to 11 years old for girls and 11 to 12 years old for boys. Precocious puberty is a physiological condition, not meant to be applied to physically healthy children. They've taken data from one group and applied it to a completely separate group of individuals who aren't suffering from underlying conditions. This is an egregious abuse and misrepresentation of data and medical practice. Ken Zucker observed that 80 to 90% of people who suffered from gender identity disorder would be comfortable with their biological sex when they reached early adulthood. The standard result of what they call gender-affirming care now is sterilization through puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, increased risk of cancer, missing forearms to construct an artificial penis that doesn't function, or the removal of a functioning penis, the inability to breastfeed, and the loss of erotic sensation in the nipples after breast removal by double mastectomy. Keep in mind, none of these treatments show evidence of mental health benefits, and the hormone blockers they prescribe to children aren't FDA approved for this treatment. Even the improvement in mood due to the pharmaceutical biochemical consequences of testosterone displays no evidence that it's linked to the gender transition process, and this is made more clear by the lack of psychological improvement that estrogen has on boys who use it. The conclusion of Ken Zucker and many other well-researched clinicians believe that gender dysphoria is a variant expression or underlying condition of the psychopathology of depression and anxiety, meaning that most patients either have high anxiety or some level of depression, and gender dysphoria can manifest from it. Well, if you've stuck around so far, I'll give you my thoughts and conclusions on everything we've discussed, and I'll wrap it up. You may ask, based if true, why do you care so much about this issue? Well, for multiple reasons. The integrity of the medical and scientific community is now being destroyed. When I have children and they're suffering from a condition or disorder that may be rare or politicized, I want to know that I can trust my doctor to have the best solution. The lie they've bought into is both worrying and disappointing, to say the least. Medicine and science are supposed to be at the forefront of development and progression in human history, but if we disregard facts and data at the cost of our own compassion, we will fail as a society. The truth should be the foundation of our lives and what we strive to discover. At this point, I am truly based when I say I don't believe gender is a concept that has any basis in science, and because of how the term gender is used, I don't believe transgender people exist in the context of the word gender. There's no such thing as changing your sex due to how it's biologically determined, and gender today is just a loose description of how you identify, but the identification is meaningless if there's no agreement on what it means or represents. The term gender identity has become a display of one's personality and personal feelings, which is an intrinsic mischaracterization of one's true identity. Your sex is your fundamental biological identity and is a determination of your chromosomes, and it's one of the most consistent parts of our anatomy and mammalian biology as a whole. Any anomaly or exception that occurs in nature is merely that, an anomaly and an exception, and even those we can't change or transition. But we should study and research it without discarding the facts about our biology. The fact that New York recognizes cross-dresser, drag king, drag queen, gender blender, and agender as official genders backed by scientific literature is a complete misrepresentation of the original ideology as a whole and of what it's become today. A failed experiment that was fostered on lies of a mentally ill man who had a dark perception of not only himself, but sex and biology as a whole, and shouldn't have any credibility in the scientific field. And the fact that governments are now levying prosecution against those who understand the truth and reality of the world is not a society or world I want to be a part of. This is a truly unique time in history where the truth matters more than ever, which is why I am now unofficially coining the term sex identity disorder instead of gender disorder, as it reflects a more accurate description of the mental illness that one can be afflicted with. And I personally want to get rid of the word gender in the context of sex as a whole, as it is a misrepresentation of sex-based sociological characteristics and traits. I challenge any YouTuber or Twitch streamer to debate this video and the evidence that I brought forward today. Share this with everybody who disagrees and get upset and start discussing. I answer any and all calls for discussion at this point in time, but if you enjoyed the video, like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Oh wait, I forgot to talk about pronouns.